Tonight on CBC Vancouver News.
We're already at capacity. Nonprofits and authorities trying to service as many asylum claimants as possible.
People in BC's immigrant support community warned Donald Trump's plan to tighten immigration could lead to more claims in Canada. Plus,
I would suggest that if we don't build that kind of infrastructure, Trump will.
a once bitter opponent of a controversial pipeline in BC now says Canada may want to build it, given Trump's tariff threats. And
I think this is going to be a difficult round of bargaining. Our members are struggling with the affordability crisis.
public sector unions head back to the bargaining table with the provincial government deep in the red.
We'll do our best at those negotiation tables, respecting our partners across the table.
This is CBC Vancouver News.
Hello, I'm Dan Burritt. Thanks for joining us. Just one day into Donald Trump's second presidency, people in BC's immigrant support community are worried. Experts warn Trump's promise to clamp down on immigration could lead to more people seeking refuge in Canada. As John Hernandez explains, local nonprofits say they are already stretched thin.
On his first day, President Trump laid out 6 executive orders targeting immigration.
I will declare a national emergency at our southern border.
The president vowed mass deportations and the militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border. His words enough to stoke already mounting anxieties here in BC.
Because this enables the president to also have the freedom of using troops.
Omar Velasquez runs a Vancouver-based settlement program for newcomers. He says the policies will likely drive people to relocate out of fear.
As this comes out on TV and social media and people are massively deported, other people that are undocumented or refugees or want to be refugees in the U.S. will start coming into Canada.
A concerning prospect in places like Metro Vancouver, where Velasquez says shelter and healthcare options for newcomers are strained.
We're already at capacity. Nonprofits and authorities trying to service as many asylum claimants as possible.
On Tuesday, federal officials said the borders are prepared to deal with a sudden surge of people trying to enter the country and sent out a warning.
It's important for folks to understand if they're planning on trying to cross the border in between our ports of entry, it is illegal to do so, and it's dangerous to do so.
The very moment that the Canadian government has decided to lower immigration numbers, we might be getting more applications.
This researcher says the vast majority of people attempting to enter the country will do so legally, and Canada might not turn everyone away.
If Canadians truly believe they're humanitarians, I think we need to think very deeply about how we can help at least a small proportion of the people who might be facing challenges in the U.S.
Still, Ottawa has earmarked more than $1 billion to tighten its borders and says it will work with Trump's government to keep them secure. John Hernandez, CBC News, Vancouver.
Premier David Eby says it is time to put up a united front and confront Trump's 25% tariff threat head on.
This is not a fight that we wanted. It's not a fight that we picked. And in fact, we think this is going to hurt Americans as badly as it does Canadians. But we're going to stand up. We're going to support federal efforts to respond with targeted tariffs to make sure that the Americans understand that we will not surrender.
Trump has suggested he could hit Canada with tariffs as early as next month. Eby says retaliatory measures could include charging American trucks to drive through Canada to Alaska, stopping the sale of U.S. alcohol in BC, and banning American companies from bidding on projects in the province. Eby is also advising Canadians to reconsider traveling to the U.S. in light of what he calls Trump's economic attack on Canadian families.
We should really be thinking carefully about spending our money in that country. And it's a bit heartbreaking to say it, to tell you the truth, because of our relationships back and forth. I don't understand why the president is doing this. I think it's bizarre.
Now, as Trump suggests tariffs on Canadian products could come in February, some here in Canada are pushing to revive a pipeline project through BC to get oil and gas to Asian markets. As Katie DeRosa reports, at least one bitter opponent is now softening their stance.
First Nations leaders and environmental groups spent years fighting Enbridge's controversial Northern Gateway pipeline project.
We will fight this.
The pipeline would have carried diluted bitumen from Alberta to Kitimat to then be shipped by tankers to Asia. But in 2016, its approval was struck down when the federal court found Ottawa had not adequately consulted with Indigenous people along the route. But now, Donald Trump's looming tariff threat has some people reconsidering the project, even those once bitterly opposed.
We are staring into the abyss of uncertainty right now with climate change, the climate crisis, and the American threat. So I would suggest that if we don't build that kind of infrastructure, Trump will.
Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre are actively pushing for a new pipeline to be built. Smith and others argue it's the only way for Canada to reduce its reliance on exports to the U.S. Assembly of First Nations Chief Terry Teegee says there's no consensus on new energy projects.
Some First Nations agree with some of the projects, whether it's Northern Gateway or LNG, and there are other First Nations that don't.
Premier David Eby says it's vital that Canada diversify its exports, but he says there are limits.
I have some differences of opinion with Premier Smith. When you're advancing proposals, I think it's critically important that the provinces where those projects may be located, the Indigenous people who may be affected, the national government, I think everybody needs to be a part of those conversations.
Despite all this, Enbridge says it currently has no plans to develop Northern Gateway. Federal Energy Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, meanwhile, says Donald Trump will be in office for the next 4 years, and building a pipeline takes much longer. Katie DeRosa, CBC News, Victoria.
Labour negotiations are looming large for the BC government this year. Almost every public sector union will be back at the bargaining table over the coming months. As Belle Puri explains, the talks come amid higher living costs and a provincial deficit.
What do we want? COLA! The last time the province's largest union negotiated with the BC government, it took 7 months of talks and a 2.5-week-long strike to get a new deal. That contract expires on March 31st.
I think this is going to be a difficult round of bargaining. Our members are struggling with the affordability crisis.
It's not just the BC General Employees Union heading to the bargaining table. Contracts for 400,000 unionized public service workers expire this year. The NDP has already made it clear that it hopes unions, the same ones that campaigned to get it elected, will curb their bargaining expectations.
We're going to reject the suggestion that we need to balance the provincial deficit on the backs of workers.
The provincial government, though, is deeply in the red.
Nurses understand the pressures. However, gone are the days that nurses are going to be tolerate being treated like handmaids.
Unionized hospital workers are also preparing their bargaining demands.
Increased wages, quality working conditions, improved working conditions, and improved health and safety.
Besides the government's fiscal state, there are other factors at play as well, factors over which the province has no control.
We will tariff and tax foreign countries to...
We're all prisoners of President Trump. What's going to happen? The Premier has painted a kind of bleak picture for the economy because of the possible tariffs.
The value of the Canadian dollar is low, inflation is still a concern, a federal election is looming, all issues further complicating an already difficult situation.
We'll do our best at those negotiation tables, respecting our partners across the table.
From government workers to nurses to hospital employees to teachers, everyone is looking for a better deal, which could make for a tumultuous spring and summer. Belle Puri, CBC News, Vancouver.
A man has now died after being shot in what Delta police call a targeted attack. Officers say they were called on Monday to a shooting at a home near 81st Avenue and 112B Street. They say they found 29-year-old Delta man Gurvinder Uppal injured. He later died in hospital. The force says they're treating this shooting as a homicide. They had a white Ford pickup found on fire nearby is connected to the killing. Vancouverites will be returning to the ballot box this spring. On April 5th, a 2-seat council by-election will be held to replace the Greens' Adrian Carr and One City's Christine Boyle, who was elected to the legislature. Rival opposition parties, meanwhile, say they have worries about transparency and accountability. We spoke with our Chad Pawson about their concerns earlier.
So this is the 4 opposition parties, all very interested in getting 1 or 2 of these seats. And what they're worried about is election financing, ongoing for a couple of years now, as an investigation by Elections BC into Vancouver's governing party, ABC Vancouver, and about contributions that were made to the party. And these groups saying that perhaps they were not made above board with our election rules, and that they want Elections BC to move a little quicker with this investigation to show if ABC broke any rules in the way they financed the 22 election. And they want this information done before the by-election so that everything is clear and above board. Here's what Pete Fry had to say about what amounts to about $116,000.
These are serious financial irregularities, and we expect that the rules apply to all of us equally. And so it does trouble us greatly to embark upon this by-election knowing that the rules are unfairly administered.
So, Dan, just to be clear, nobody has said there's any wrongdoing here. We're still waiting for Elections to BC come out with that. But there is concern that that we're not going to know before the by-election on April 5th.
All right. And what more can you tell us about the plans for the by-election itself, Chad?
Yeah, so I'll say the 4 opposition parties all planning on running at least 1 candidate. One City, the Greens, and COPE only going to run 1 candidate. They don't want to split votes. Team, Colleen Hardwick's party, a former councillor, they're going to run 2 candidates. In council today, the plan that was approved for this by-election, there was a lot of concern from current councillors about voter turnout. The last by-election in Vancouver 2017, about 11% turnout of eligible voters. So a lot of concern that we're not going to get high numbers for this by-election, so they want to make sure staff's doing work to properly promote the by-election, to make sure that voters are able to mail in ballots. Anybody can apply for a mail-in ballot if they want for this election. So work underway now to make sure the by-election's known about. There'll be advanced voting, and then election day, of course, for a 12-hour voting period on April 5th.
All right, Chad Possum, thanks very much. After stiff opposition from some community members, the City of Vancouver says it will no longer build a training facility for the national men's soccer team at Memorial South Park.
And it really is the heart of our community. It would have been closed for close to 2 years.
The plan would have closed the park to the public until the fall of 2026, when the FIFA Men's World Cup does come to town. Instead, the city now plans to use the existing National Soccer Development Centre at UBC. BC Place is set to host 7 games as part of the continent-wide tournament in the summer of 2026. With the flu season in full swing here, hospital officials are asking parents and guardians of young children to take a few steps before they decide to take kids to an emergency room.
Things that we do get concerned about, of course, are if you're having or your child's having difficulty breathing, things like fevers that can be managed at home with a Tylenol or Advil, and mild cold symptoms. That's something that can be managed at home.
BC Children's admits between 140 and 180 kids a day. The hospital says nearly half of those cases are respiratory illnesses. Darius is here with our look at the weather and some temperatures returning to normal, you said?
Yes, here in BC at least. Over in eastern Canada and in the southern U.S., very different story, but we'll talk more about that later in the show. For now, here in BC, the next big story is probably going to be a bit of a storm system is going to be rolling down the coast. You don't see much here in this view because we don't have radar coverage over on the coast. But if we take a look at that moisture that's streaming in here, you can see there's going to be some snow coming down. And that's exactly what's happening, especially around Stewart, where around 10 to 20 centimeters of snow are expected by the time we get through tomorrow. So snow warning in place there. Everywhere else, though, things remain fairly calm for now. Here on the south coast, though, we will see a little bit of precipitation for the first time in a while, but then at the end of the week, Dan, we return to the sunshine.
Okay. Thanks, Darius.
Thank you.
Nimo rings in its 150th year since incorporation. We'll tell you how it plans to mark its milestone after this.
I think it's important to give a human face
to the stories that we hear every day, the people that they affect. And I think talking to those people is what really gives us the true sense of the impact of the stories that we're hearing.
Nanaimo has a big birthday this year. As the CBC's Claire Palmer explains, it's marking 150 years of incorporation.
150 years ago, Nanaimo looked very different. It was at the old courthouse on January 22, 1875, that Nanaimo held its first council meeting, 2 days after its first mayoral election.
Firstly, I wasn't here for the first council meeting. Let me assure everyone of that. But I certainly am very proud. I'm proud of this city. I'm proud of what it's achieved in the 150 years since contact. I think our work around reconciliation, the growth, the development we see here, the university, we're a port city. Nanaimo's got everything going for it.
Nanaimo is one of BC's oldest municipalities and was just the 6th city to incorporate, older even than Vancouver. Still, the area was populated well before that.
Well, it's a really interesting celebration. I would like to sort of preface it by saying that it is literally the 150th anniversary of the formal creation of the city, the corporation of the city of Nanaimo. Of course, there were people here before that, and most specifically the Nanaimo for thousands of years.
Here at the Nanaimo Archives, a clear picture of how different Nanaimo was when coal dominated the economy. Since then, Nanaimo has grown in industry, adding forestry and tourism, and amalgamation in the mid-1970s saw it grow its city limits.
If a dirty little town founded in the 1850s based on the extraction of a single resource can turn into the beautiful park-like setting that it is now, you know, pretty much anybody can do it. It's a really good example of sort of evolution over time. Slow, difficult, but useful and nice in the end.
Commemorations like 100th or 150th, like in this situation, really allow or encourage is reflection. Where have we been? And then, of course, that has us thinking about where we're at right now and what are some of the opportunities that could be here in the future and what kind of community do we want to see going forward.
The city is hosting a month-long art festival to celebrate starting January 23rd, featuring a light-based art installation at Maffeo Sutton Park and work done by local artists. Claire Palmer, CBC News, Nanaimo.
Advocates are sounding the alarm over Premier David Eby's education mandate. He's proposed a review of school programs. And as Jessica Chung reports, some are worried it could lead to cuts.
Public education advocates in Surrey are raising concerns about Premier David Eby's mandate letter sent to Education Minister Lisa Baer. Now, the provincial government released the letters last week, outlining specific priorities for each ministry. And representatives from the Surrey Teachers Association, CUPE 728, and Surrey District Parent Advisory Council took issue with the education letter's first point. It asked the ministry to review all existing programs and initiatives to ensure they're relevant, efficient, and cost-effective. And to the advocacy groups, they say that sounds like cuts.
When you look at some of the wording and the language that's used, it really is coded for cuts, in our opinion. So when you talk about efficiencies in key programs, what you end up doing is not looking at the children on the edges of mainstream education that need really specific supports.
They say the lack of resources puts a huge strain on teachers and, above all, students. They also mentioned this closing of South Surrey White Rock Learning Centre due to financial challenges. It's one of 3 alternative education programs that will shut their doors by the end of this school year, leaving only 2 centres in the area. They say they're concerned that vulnerable youth will be put at risk without these types of programs.
We, as teachers, we know what our students need, and we can adapt and, kind of like change the circumstances, but it becomes more and more difficult when classrooms are overcrowded.
They're calling on the Premier to reject the review of education programs and initiatives and focus on putting those resources back into the classroom, including making good on a campaign promise to put an educational assistant in every K to grade 3 classroom, plus a mental health counselor in every school. Jessica Chung, CBC News, Surrey.
There was snow falling in Revelstoke early in the morning as a freight train headed west out of the city. Darius has a look at your BC-wide weather forecast coming up. Donald Trump was busy pushing ahead with his agenda on his first full day back as U.S. president. But as Paul Hunter reports, the commander-in-chief also received a message directly from the pulpit.
Inside Washington's National Cathedral, beginning the first full day of Donald Trump's return to the presidency, the traditional inaugural prayer service.
As a country, we have gathered this morning.
And in a place rarely used for politics, Trump was taken on directly.
Let me make one final plea, Mr. President.
With he and his family watching came specific reference to gay and transgender people and undocumented migrants at a time Trump has pledged mass deportations.
In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. The vast majority of immigrants are not criminals.
Trump gave no visible reaction, though
Mr. President, what did you think of the sermon?
later underlining for reporters.
Not too exciting, was it? I didn't think it was a good service, no. Thank you very much.
For Trump, the pushback then continued. A day after, he suggested again that he's interested in retaking control of the Panama Canal. Panama sent a letter to alert the United Nations.
Muy buenos días.
While Mexico's president underlined in her country that body of water to the east will always be the Gulf of Mexico, not, as Trump asserts, the Gulf of America, adding,
First of all, I would like to assure the people of Mexico that we will always defend our sovereignty and our independence.
Thank you.
Then, late in the day, flanked by three big tech CEOs, this word of a new public-private partnership here to be known as Stargate, with investments up to $500 billion aimed at supercharging growth in artificial intelligence.
To announce the largest AI infrastructure project by far in history, and it's all taking place right here in America.
Paul Hunter reporting. Now, hundreds of rioters convicted in the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol are back on the streets tonight. The result of President Trump's extraordinary sweeping pardon that's being celebrated and denounced. Katie Simpson has the story from Washington and a warning. It does contain offensive language.
Still wearing his orange prison-issued shoes, William Sarsfield is among the first of the January 6th rioters to be freed.
Power of prayer is a very strong thing. When I looked out the window and seen my girlfriend with my truck with the flag in the back of it sitting on the side of the road with a bunch of other people that were there to pick us up, it was all part of God's plan, and he only knew the timing.
Sarsfield was in this crowd at the Capitol, convicted on multiple felony and misdemeanor counts, including for violent offenses. Now that he's out, he plans to return home to Texas.
Relaxation without the feds over my butt.
When you hear people who are critical of Donald Trump's decision to pardon people convicted of these crimes, what do you say to them?
I say that's a felon's act. I mean, he is our president. It's his choice.
It's a surreal scene outside the D.C. jail where offenders are being released, drawing members of the alt-right militia, the Proud Boys.
We're going to see our brothers come out today. Back to freedom, back to dignity.
That our flag was still there. And then there's Trump supporters so excited they spontaneously burst into song. All while people living in a nearby apartment scream expletives at the show below.
So this is January 6th?
The president pardoned roughly 1,600 offenders and commuted the sentences of more than a dozen people, including the leader of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers.
I've been betrayed by my country.
Former police officer Michael Fanone was severely beaten and tased during the riot. He fears his attackers will now seek revenge.
My only thoughts are for the safety of my family and myself.
Trump is defending his decision, saying these convictions ruined the lives of rioters, while also trying to argue he doesn't condone violence against police. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
Prime Minister Trudeau is promising a very strong response if the U.S. imposes tariffs on Canadian goods. President Trump already suggested he could follow through on that by the end of next week. The CBC's Ashley Burke is in Quebec, where the federal cabinet is strategizing on how to deal with the threat.
Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning.
The Prime Minister says his cabinet's sole focus is stopping U.S. tariffs. But if Donald Trump doesn't back down, Canada will hit back.
Our response will be robust and rapid and measured, but very strong. The goal will be to get those tariffs off as quickly as possible.
To do that, Justin Trudeau says everything is on the table, even matching tariffs on U.S. goods.
I support the principle of dollar for dollar matching tariffs. It's something that we are absolutely going to be looking at if that is how they move forward.
Trudeau and his cabinet meeting again after a chaotic day. Trump originally signed an executive order saying tariffs could happen after a 3-month study.
We are establishing the External Revenue Service to collect all tariffs.
But late last night, Trump threw Canada off kilter, musing to reporters he could impose a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods next week.
Canada's a very bad abuser also. Vast numbers of people to come in and fentanyl to come in.
When do you think you would enact those?
I think February 1st.
Canada's ambassador to the U.S. says bad abuser isn't how Canada would talk about its closest ally when it comes to border security.
It's part of an overall strategy, a bit of distraction, a bit of having people focus on a word that's being used and not on getting down to the work.
The industry minister says if Trump wants to bring in his golden age, he needs Canada to make it shine.
They understand, they're in the front line of that. They understand that they won't be tariffed without impact, they cannot be tariffed without consequences, and they cannot be tariffed without costs for the U.S. consumers.
If there is a trade war, Trudeau says the government plans on compensating Canadian consumers and businesses. Ashley Burke, CBC News, Montebello, Quebec.
New data from Statistics Canada shows inflation in December fell to 1.8%. The drop in costs for restaurant food, alcohol, and children's clothing happened during the federal government's GST holiday. Without the tax break, the agency says the inflation rate would have gone up to 2.3%. January will see a full month of exemption compared to just 18 days in December. The GST break will continue until the middle of February. The Bank of Canada is set to make an interest rate decision next week, and the December dip in inflation could prompt another cut from the central bank. While there is fragile peace in the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank, military operations have begun. Why Israeli forces are focusing on that region. Next. No city in Canada has as intimate a relationship with the United States as does Windsor, Ontario. Nestled just south of Detroit, the United States looms large over the entire region. Just down the river is the community of Amherstburg, a place that saw battles in the War of 1812 between what was then Upper Canada and the United States. President Trump has recently mused about eliminating the borders. Katie Fraser visited the former battleground to find out how people are feeling about his inauguration and his threats.
I'm standing here now in Navy Yard Park. We're right on the Detroit River with Michigan, between Michigan and Amherstburg, Ontario. And something really interesting in this park is that there's still these large cannons on display outdoors, pointed at Michigan from this side of the border. Another reminder of the battles that took place here in 1812 and helped establish our border with the U.S.
The president at the time basically stated that going into Upper Canada would just be a matter of mere marching. In other words, they would just walk into Canada, show their colors, show their troops, and everybody would fall into line. But actually the opposite happened. The Canadians and the British and the First Nations joined forces and basically drew a line in the sand.
Standing on this side of the river, you can easily see Michigan. With Donald Trump calling Canada the 51st state.
You get rid of that artificially drawn line, and you take a look at what that looks like, and it would also be much better for national security. Don't forget, we basically protect Canada.
I'm wondering how people here are feeling, being so close to the U.S. border.
I feel a little nervous about it, for sure, yeah.
You do?
Yeah, I don't trust Trump.
What do you think about him calling Canada the 51st state?
Oh, I won't even say what I think about that. I mean, that just makes me so angry. And he's a bully and worse.
What does this inauguration day mean to you?
Well, it's scary because of my job.
Really?
Working in the tool and die and steel industry, you know, with tariffs and stuff like that coming up potentially. Yeah, it's a little scary.
Donald Trump's been calling Canada the 51st state. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, California might just be the next province. I don't know about us being a state, though.
These days, it's impossible to take over a country anymore. There's so much support out there. But we got to figure out Canada. That's the big thing.
We still have some cannons facing their way.
They're all plugged up. Only thing to shoot out of there are squirrels, because they all live in there.
The park here along the water in Amherstburg, Ontario is a really popular spot for people out walking, with their dogs especially. This whole park is surrounded by little cafes and restaurants, businesses, a very different look from what took place here more than 200 years ago. Katie Fraser, CBC News, Amherstburg.
The ceasefire in Gaza continues to hold. But now Israeli security forces are focusing on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. At least 8 people have been killed and dozens more wounded in what Israel's prime minister calls an extensive and significant military operation. The CBC senior correspondent Sasha Petrusik has more from Jerusalem.
The Israeli military operation today is one of the more serious flashpoints that we've seen over the last little while. It's in the north end of the occupied West Bank and around the area of Jenin and the adjacent refugee camps. Now, these camps have been known as bases for various militant groups, including Hamas and Islamic Jihad, groups that Israel considers to be allied with Iran and therefore a major enemy. This has been an area of friction, not only between these militant groups and Israel, but also a problem for the Palestinian Authority. That is the group that runs many things in the occupied territories and has had its own forces tied up in these camps and in these areas for a while. Now, the occupied West Bank in general has seen a higher level of volatility over the last little while, partly because of Israeli settlers who have attacked a number of Palestinian villages and encampments, farm fields, those kinds of things, setting cars on fire, and in some cases, fighting with Palestinians. These groups have become more aggressive as the war in Gaza has gone on, and the former President of the United States, Joe Biden, had tried imposing sanctions on some of the more violent settlers in that area. Well, with an executive order, Donald Trump has removed those sanctions. So these groups also feel more empowered. They also have allies within the ruling coalition in Israel, the political parties there. And so this has raised the tension level in the West Bank. These actions today, this military operation, could raise them even further. So we could see an escalation of the kind of violence that has occasionally broken out in the occupied West Bank. Sasha Petrusik, CBC News, Jerusalem.
More than 70 people are dead and dozens injured after a fire at a ski resort in northwestern Turkey. The blaze that erupted in the middle of the night caused panic among the hundreds of guests staying there. Margaret Evans has more.
The fire began in darkness when most in the 12-story hotel would have been sleeping. Some survivors saying they were woken not by fire alarms, but by people shouting. The flames spread quickly. By morning, some of the upper floors were still on fire, and witnesses were trying to come to terms with what they'd seen. Omer Sakrak, who works at a nearby hotel, says it took a long time for fire trucks to arrive. During that time, people started to jump in panic, he says. There was nothing we could do. We just watched people jump like that. Others tied bed sheets together in the hopes of escaping. Mevlut Ozer, another hotel worker, describes it as an apocalypse. There were some extra beds on the first floor, he says, so we threw those down so people would fall on soft ground if they jumped. We saw people on the higher floors. All we could do was cry. The hotel is situated in a popular ski resort in Turkey's Bolu Mountains, and the fire has come in the middle of school holidays. Turkish authorities say there were 238 registered guests. An investigation is now underway, according to the tourism minister Mehmet Nuri Ersoy. There had been no report of fire safety concerns at the hotel before now, he says. Turkey has had a poor record of enforcing building safety codes in the past. 4 individuals, including the owner of the hotel, have reportedly been detained. Margaret Evans, CBC News, London.
Britain's leader is calling for fundamental change in how that country deals with violent people. This comes a day after a British teen pleaded guilty to murdering 3 young girls in a knife attack last summer. Keir Starmer's Labour government is setting up a public inquiry to look into the Southport stabbings. Crystal Gumansing has more.
In announcing the public inquiry earlier today here at Number 10, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said the responsibility for the murder of the 3 young girls lies with Axel Rudakabana. However, Starmer says there were government failures that, as he put it, leap off the page.
Southport must be a line in the sand. Look, nothing will be off the table in this inquiry. Nothing. And most importantly, it will lead to change.
The public inquiry and new details about the case are now being openly discussed because on Monday, at the start of his trial in Liverpool, Rudakabana pleaded guilty to the 3 murder charges. He also pleaded guilty to 10 charges of attempted murder relating to the attacks at the Taylor Swift-themed dance class in Southport last July and to producing the deadly poison ricin and possessing an al-Qaeda training manual. The murders of B.B. King, Elsie Sancombe, and Alice De Silva Aguirre led to widespread and violent riots. Unrest fueled in part by misinformation about Rudakabana being an illegal immigrant and rumors of a government cover-up. Rudakabana had been referred to a government program called Prevent, which identifies those with extremist views and tries to prevent attacks, a fact Starmer and others knew.
It would not have been right to disclose those details. The only losers, if the details had been disclosed, would be the victims and the families, because it ran the risk the trial would collapse.
The deadly knife attack was not labeled as terrorism at the time. Starmer now says the incident shows terrorism has evolved beyond organized groups with political motives. Policies aimed at protecting the public may need to be updated.
In the wake of such a monstrous atrocity, we have to ask every question, no matter how difficult, and where change is needed, we must act. That is now our task. We owe that to the victims.
While the timeline for the public inquiry and the scope of it has not yet been laid out, Rudakabana will be sentenced in Liverpool on Thursday. Crystal Gamansing, CBC News, London.
U.S. President Trump will visit Los Angeles on Friday to meet with people affected by those devastating wildfires. This is a new blaze burning overnight in the LA area called the Chambers Fire. Much of Southern California remains under a red flag warning because of strong Santa Ana winds. The mayor of Los Angeles said those winds will soon be replaced by rain, but that could create new dangerous problems.
Today, I'm issuing an executive order to shore up burn areas and stem the flow of toxic debris in the event of rain this weekend.
The mayor also delivered some more positive news today. She says the Palisades fire is now 61% contained and that the city is moving full speed ahead on rebuilding and recovery. Mayor Bass says hundreds of people are now able to return to their homes within the burned area. Darius Madabi here with our full forecast. Frigid you have there up on the label. But
yes.
Not for us, right?
Not for us, no. I want to talk a little bit about the southern U.S. first before we get into us. And if we zoom in here, you can see some very cold air coming down to the deep south. We're talking Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, all these areas seeing temperatures dip below zero, which is very unusual. We also, at the same time, have a lot of moisture sitting over the Gulf of Mexico. And those two things, that cold air and that warm, moist air, when they meet, mean a heck of a lot of snow. You can see those two things meeting here, and if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that snow that's been coming across pretty much right through the day. In fact, well, take a look at what it looks like. This is New Orleans, a place that is not accustomed to snow. The last time they got any measurable snow was 2009. The last time they got anything near as much snow as they're getting today, or have gotten today, was all the way back in 1895. They got 20 centimeters of snow. Now, here they're still looking at some fair totals. That's why we have warnings across the board here. Winter storm warnings, extreme cold warnings, things that some people in BC might scoff at. Temperatures between 0 and minus 10, but down there, definitely extreme cold. And that snow is going to keep moving off over the next few hours, but still, those totals were expected to be close to, we're going to flip this loop again, 22 centimeters in New Orleans is what this model was calling for. But if we take a look at the actual totals, what we actually saw, closer to 35 centimeters of snow coming to that area. That's what we've seen so far. So definitely significant. I also want to quickly mention that cold that we've been seeing across North America, definitely significant here, but just a reminder that that's not the story around the world. Temperatures over the last couple of days have actually been record high for this day of the year. So also worth noting. Now, let's take a look at our conditions here in BC, where we've had some moisture feeding into the coast. That's leading to some precipitation that's going to be working its way down the coast as well, but really not too significant for the south coast. Parts of the North Island will get some rain tomorrow and then again on Thursday. But besides that, a few showers and flurries spread down the coast on Thursday. Possibility that we don't even really see it here on the lower mainland. Temperatures are also climbing across the country, but across the province, but sticking around seasonal, so not really worth noting. We have a lot of sunshine in the south tomorrow. Before that, those flurries and showers arrive tomorrow. In terms of 5-day forecast, Dan, we've got some sunshine, some flurries, and then a return to sunshine.
Okay.
But still chilly.
No kidding. Thanks, Darius.
Thank you.
If you love the movies but not the crowds, coming up, we check out a tiny theater, barely big enough for a bug.
There's an extra tiny entertainment venue on Vancouver's east side you may have walked by without even noticing.
A miniature movie theater that's generating a big buzz in the art community. Maurice Katz explains.
You've heard of the big screen, but what about the small screen? Like, really small. You push the button, peek through the hole, and it plays a snippet of a movie.
Good day. Hi. May I see your license and registration, please?
It's hidden around the corner of the Vancouver Hack Space in East Vancouver. Janet Mader and David Bino designed the incredibly intricate miniature theater. It's based off of one that used to exist nearby.
We did some research and found the Vancouver Pantages was built in 1908, and it was, until it got knocked down, the oldest surviving vaudeville theater in Canada.
They also decide what's playing.
We do take requests. Sometimes our ideas will come from, we're just watching old things, and like ideas will present themselves. Sometimes we'll respond to, holidays or, current events.
Good evening. Edwin S. Simon report.
The theater first opened in December last year, and they say they're still figuring out what exactly their role is in the neighborhood. But one thing's for sure, you'll be tempted to take a peek at what's playing, if you know where to look. Maurice Katz, CBC News, Vancouver.
Next, something you might not be aware of. Today is National Hug Day.
While the idea of hugging someone you don't know might send you running for the hills, we spoke with one Vancouver Island woman who says touch is a necessity of life. She ought to know. Jenny Doyle is a certified cuddler.
Everybody seems to have this desire to know what is normal in a cuddle session. And I would just straight off the bat say that there is no normal. We have a set of, rules that we follow. And outside of those or inside of those, anything goes. Some people prefer just to have someone to sit next to them. Some people want to be held tightly. There's not a normal cuddle session because every person is so unique and their needs and comfort level is really unique as well.
No kidding.
Didn't notice you're going to be back on camera. Thanks for being with us tonight on CBC Vancouver News at 6. You can watch this newscast on CBC Gem, our free app, as well as on YouTube and our website, cbc.ca/BC.
And we'll have your next local news at 11 o'clock right after the National. Good night.